You ever hear a story about a man who spent over a decade behind bars, locked away from the streets he ruled, only to come back and make every traitor wish they'd never been born? That was Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, a man whose name alone commanded fear, respect, and loyalty. But even legends have enemies, and some of those enemies once walked right beside him, trusted and protected. It was a Friday night in Harlem, June 10th, 1963. The streets were alive with music, laughter, and the smell of sizzling ribs from the best clubs in the neighborhood. Small's Paradise, a hot spot where the rich and powerful of Harlem gathered, was packed with people celebrating the weekend. But none of the patrons had any idea that history was about to unfold at Table 7. That table held a man who thought he had escaped justice, who had spent 11 years thinking Bumpy Johnson would never return. The man was Marcus Smooth Henderson, Bumpy's former protege. A young hustler from 118th Street. He had learned everything from Bumpy: the numbers game, policy banks, the secrets of surviving Harlem streets. And yet, while Bumpy served time in Alcatraz, Smooth had betrayed him. He gave up the locations of Bumpy's businesses, told Italians exactly where Bumpy's operations were, and claimed the profits for himself. For 11 years, Smooth lived like a king, believing he had outsmarted the legendary Bumpy Johnson. But Bumpy had been watching. Every day in prison, he thought, he planned, and he waited. He knew who had taken what, who had betrayed trust, and who had forgotten the man who built Harlem streets. When he finally stepped off the train from San Francisco, 56 years old, gray-haired, but as sharp as ever, Bumpy didn't go home. He didn't see his wife. He didn't rest. He went straight to his loyal friends, men who had stayed true through the years, men who remembered what loyalty and respect meant. That night, Bumpy walked into Small's Paradise like a ghost from Harlem's past. The music didn't stop, but conversations shifted. Heads turned. People whispered. Even young hustlers who had only heard the stories paused mid-step. And then their eyes found Table 7. Smooth Henderson, dressed in a cream-colored suit with diamond rings glinting under the lights, was holding court as usual, laughing, confident, untouchable. But he had no idea that his past had just walked into the room. Bumpy didn't need guns or an army. He had reputation, intelligence, and timing. And he had patience. Sitting at a table right next to Smooth, Bumpy and his loyalists waited. Every move was calculated. Every glance was measured. The tension in the air was so thick, you could almost taste it. Customers froze. Waiters stopped in their tracks, and the jazz band played the last note of melody before silence took over. And then it happened. Bumpy spoke the words that would make every betrayer in Harlem sit up and take notice. The man who had stolen from him, the man who thought he had escaped for 11 years, now faced a cold, calm stare of the king himself. The room seemed to shrink. Smooth's confidence faltered. His bodyguards tensed, unsure of what might come next. And in Bumpy's hand, the razor glinted in the light, the same blade that had once shaped his legend and sent a message across Harlem streets. What happened next would not just mark a phase, but would change the balance of power in Harlem forever. No one in that room would forget it. Every eye was watching, every heart racing, and every person knew. They were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. But the story doesn't end here. Smooth Henderson had no idea that the life he had built on betrayal was about to crumble. The question is, how far would Bumpy go to reclaim what was his? And what lesson would Harlem learn that night about loyalty, respect, and power? The answers are coming, but first, you need to see what happened at Table 7, when the razor came out and history was written in blood. Well, almost. For 11 years, Harlem had changed, but some things never did. The clubs were brighter, the streets busier, the new faces bolder, but the stories of Bumpy Johnson never faded. Old-timers still whispered his name, and even the younger hustlers, who had never seen him in person, felt the weight of his legend. They knew Bumpy wasn't just a man. He was a force, a presence that shaped every alley, every policy bank, every deal in the neighborhood. And now he had returned, calm but deadly, carrying the memory of every slight, every betrayal, and every unpaid debt. Smooth Henderson had believed in his cleverness. He had thought that while Bumpy rotted in Alcatraz, the streets were his for the taking. He built his empire on trust he had never earned, on deals with men who respected power only when it was already in their hands. But power that comes from fear alone is fragile. Smooth had counted on the Italians, on his bodyguards, and on his charm to protect him. He never imagined that Bumpy would return, not just alive, but ready to reclaim what was his, step by step, in a way that everyone could see. Junie Bird, sitting across from Bumpy, had been a silent witness for most of the night. At 63, Junie had the face of a man who had seen too much, yet his eyes were sharp, alert, calculating. He had been Bumpy's right hand for decades, loyal through the prison years, keeping an eye on the neighborhood, watching every move, remembering every name. Junie had seen Smooth rise, seen him betray, and now he saw the moment when the old rules of Harlem would be reintroduced. Not with words, but with presence, timing, and the razor in Bumpy's hand. As Bumpy waited, the restaurant seemed to shrink around the tension. Smooth's mind raced. The casual confidence he had carried for over a decade had evaporated in seconds. He remembered the lessons Bumpy had taught him. Lessons about respect, loyalty, and power. But now those lessons were turning into warnings etched in reality. Every man who had once called Harlem home had heard rumors about Bumpy's methods, his precision, the way he made statements without unnecessary violence. And now Smooth was living that lesson firsthand. Bumpy didn't just come for revenge. He came with purpose. Every movement was deliberate. His calmness made the entire room uneasy, every whisper fading as the eyes of the patrons followed him. Old friends, old enemies, young hustlers, and working men all watched the scene unfold. Bumpy knew that a public display of authority would send a message far beyond the walls of Small's paradise. He understood the psychology of fear, the power of reputation, and the weight of historical legacy. And most importantly, he knew that Smooth's fear was only the beginning of a ripple that would spread through Harlem like fire. Behind the tension at Table 7 was more than betrayal. There were stories of survival, of strategy, of men trying to outsmart a legend. Smooth had made deals with outsiders, thinking Bumpy would never return. He had thought the Italians could shield him, that old allies would forget that years behind bars were a permanent absence. But Bumpy had seen everything, calculated every risk, and remembered every slight. The room felt like it held its breath, waiting for the next move, for the moment when past and present would collide. The other patrons, though hidden behind plates and glasses, could sense the history in the making. They weren't just witnessing a personal confrontation. They were seeing a living legend redefine the rules of power in Harlem. The waiters froze mid-step. The musicians paused mid-note. And the hum of conversation stopped entirely. Every eye was on Bumpy and Smooth, and every mind was trying to guess what would happen next. Would it end with violence, with a word, with fear alone? No one knew. And in that moment, Bumpy's story wasn't just about him or Smooth Henderson. It was about Harlem itself, the streets, the loyalties, the betrayals, the power struggles. Every scar, every whispered name, every lesson in respect carried weight. Smooth was learning that now, under the watchful eyes of the neighborhood, under the presence of a man who had survived Alcatraz and betrayal, under the shadow of a razor that could change lives with a single cut. The tension hadn't been resolved. Smooth's fate hung in the balance. Harlem waited, and everyone present understood that tonight, the streets remembered who truly ran them. Smooth Henderson sat frozen at Table 7, the cream-colored suit now feeling heavier than ever, weighed down by the fear he had never expected to face again. He could feel every eye in Small's paradise on him, every whisper of the crowd pressing against his ears. His bodyguards had backed out, but their absence only amplified the danger he now felt. He had spent over a decade believing he had escaped accountability. And yet here was Bumpy Johnson, calm, deliberate, and deadly, waiting for him to realize the consequences of betrayal. Across the table, Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every movement, every glance, every subtle shift of his body radiated control. Harlem itself seemed to lean in, watching him like an old friend and a stern teacher at the same time. For the patrons, the scene was mesmerizing. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was a lesson in respect, power, and survival. Men who had once tried to carve their own paths in Harlem were suddenly reminded that the streets belonged to someone far older, far smarter, and far more patient than they had ever anticipated. Junie Bird, sitting beside Bumpy, kept a watchful eye on the entrances and the crowd. His fingers tapped lightly against the handle of his revolver under the table, a quiet rhythm of vigilance that spoke volumes about the tension in the room. Willie Fish Jackson leaned slightly forward, and Quick Lewis's hand hovered near his sidearm. These were men who had followed Bumpy through every storm, and their loyalty wasn't just allegiance. It was a promise that traitors would face consequences. Smooth tried to form words, but the fear made his throat dry. His mind flashed back to the first lessons Bumpy had taught him, the days when he was young, ambitious, and trusted. How easily he had been brought into the fold, how patiently Bumpy had shown him the streets, taught him the numbers game, and protected him from rivals. He had thought those lessons were a foundation for his success, a roadmap to power. But now they felt like chains, a reminder how far he had strayed and how badly he had underestimated the man he once called a mentor. Meanwhile, the patrons of Small's Paradise began to notice other subtle things. Some of the older men recognized a razor in Bumpy's pocket, the same blade that had once sent messages across Harlem without a single word. Some of the younger hustlers leaned closer, trying to see if the stories were true, that Bumpy Johnson had returned not just to collect, but to teach a lesson in loyalty and betrayal. The restaurant itself had become a stage, the audience uncomfortably aware that history was unfolding in front of them. But Bumpy's focus wasn't on theatrics. His eyes never left Smooth's. Every pause, every hesitation, every feigned attempt at confidence from Smooth only sharpened the intensity. He could see the guilt, the fear, and the regret etched into his former protege's face. Harlem's past and present collided in that moment. Smooth had made deals with the Italians, thought he had secured safety and wealth, but Bumpy knew every move, every transaction, every hidden betrayal. And now, with 250 witnesses and the quiet tension of the neighborhood pressing in, it was clear that nothing could hide from a man who built Harlem streets. Outside, the night had deepened, but inside, time seemed to stretch and bend. The music from the corner band had faded to silence, replaced by the low hum of anticipation. Each man at the tables around them tried to pretend they weren't watching, but everyone's attention was caught. Even the cooks in the kitchen peeked from behind the swinging doors. In the corner, a young man whispered his friend, "That's Bumpy Johnson. I thought he was gone forever." Smooth's mind raced for a way out. He tried bargaining, thinking words could undo what had been built over 11 years. But he remembered the way Bumpy had taught him, not lessons of mercy, but lessons of accountability. Bumpy didn't negotiate when the time for justice came. He acted, and the consequences were precise and unforgettable. The room held its breath as Bumpy slowly leaned forward, the steel of the razor catching the dim light, glinting like a warning. The tension was unbearable, stretching every second into a lifetime. Every patron knew that in the next moments, something would happen that no one in Harlem would ever forget. Smooth Henderson had spent 11 years thinking he had escaped his past, but now the truth was clear. Some debts cannot be outrun, and some lessons cannot be ignored. Smooth Henderson could feel the sweat running down his back, not from heat, but from the weight of every eye in the room. Bumpy Johnson sat across from him, calm, measured, like the storm itself had chosen to take human form. The razor in Bumpy's hand was more than steel. It was a symbol, a reminder that betrayal had consequences. That respect in Harlem wasn't given. It was demanded, and it was enforced in ways a man never forgot. The restaurant was quiet now, but it wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of attention. Conversations had stopped. Plates had been set down mid-bite, and even the jazz band had frozen mid-note, leaving only the tension to fill the room. Every patron, young or old, knew they were witnessing something historic. Every glance toward Table 7 was heavy with the knowledge that the godfather of Harlem had returned, and he had come not just for a reunion, but for a reckoning. Smooth tried to steady his breathing, tried to remind himself that he had survived Harlem streets for over a decade, that he had alliances, that he had made deals. But none of that mattered now. He was facing the man who had built those streets, the man who had taught him everything he knew, the man whose name alone had kept him alive all these years. And now that man was here, patient, precise, and ready to remind him, and everyone watching, what betrayal cost. Junie Bird leaned back slightly, his hand never leaving the grip of his revolver. Willie Fish Jackson shifted his weight, sawed-off shotgun resting quietly against his leg, eyes scanning for anyone who might think this was their chance to interfere. Quick Lewis's revolver pointed subtly, a warning more than a threat. The Loyalists weren't here for violence. They were here to make sure the lesson landed without chaos. Harlem didn't need another shootout. It needed clarity, and Bumpy Johnson was about to give it. Smoot's hands trembled as he tried to form words. "I can explain," he stammered. His voice sounded small, pathetic even, compared to calm authority radiating from Bumpy. The man who once called him protege now held every advantage. Every betrayal Smooth had committed, every deal he had made, every dollar he had stolen. All of it weighed heavily in that room, and Bumpy didn't need to speak them aloud. Smooth felt the weight in silence, in every measured movement of Bumpy's eyes, in the way the razor reflected the dim light of Small's paradise. Outside, the night air pressed against the windows, but inside, time had slowed. Smoot's mind flashed back to the first days under Bumpy's guidance, the trust, the protection, the mentorship, and then the last days when promises went unkept, when letters stopped, when money disappeared, and when he made the choice to hand Harlem over to outsiders for safety. Every memory now felt like a chain, each one linking him closer to the moment he had been running from for 11 years. Bumpy leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on Smooth's, and the razor moved just enough to catch the light. Not a threat, not yet, but a warning so precise it carried its own weight. Smooth's bodyguards had long since stepped away, leaving him exposed. The patrons leaned in, almost unconsciously, drawn to the tension as if it were a magnet. Every second stretched, every breath held. Every mind in that room anticipated what would happen next, knowing that Harlem's history was being rewritten at Table 7. And then, in the quiet hum of anticipation, Bumpy's hand moved with precision that silenced even the whispers in the back. The room waited, holding its collective breath, as the moment of reckoning approached, the razor glinting like a promise of truth and a warning to anyone who had ever thought they could escape justice. The climax wasn't here yet, but everyone in Small's paradise felt it coming, unavoidable and irreversible. Just as Smooth Henderson thought the moment couldn't get any worse, the front door of Small's paradise creaked open, and a shadow fell across the room. Heads turned, and the low hum of anticipation in the restaurant shifted into a nervous ripple. It wasn't another patron. It was a man with a familiar swagger, a sharp suit, and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Vinny the Hawk Moretti, an ambitious young enforcer from the Genovese family, had slipped into the club unnoticed. For years, he had been plotting to gain favor in Harlem, while Bumpy was locked away, eager to make a name for himself. Vinny's eyes scanned the room and immediately landed on Smooth Henderson. His lips curled in satisfaction. He had assumed that with Bumpy gone for 11 years, Smooth was the undisputed ruler of Harlem, the man to watch. He had expected a simple transaction tonight. Perhaps a deal, perhaps a subtle show of power. What he didn't expect was Bumpy Johnson, alive and sitting next to his prey, his razor glinting in the dim lights. Vinny froze, realizing that the story he had counted on for years was being rewritten before his eyes. Smooth's panic surged anew. Not only was Bumpy in front of him, razor in hand, but now an outsider, someone connected to the Italians, was watching everything. Smooth tried to explain, stammering through excuses, hoping Vinny would intervene. It's nothing, just business. You don't need to. But Vinny didn't move. He understood the gravity of the situation in a split second. This wasn't just about Smooth or Bumpy. This was Harlem itself asserting who controlled it. Bumpy's gaze flicked toward the newcomer, and the air shifted again. The presence of Vinny Moretti introduced a new layer of tension. The possibility that an outside faction could try to turn the confrontation into chaos. But Bumpy remained calm, the razor still in his hand, his eyes locked on Smooth. He didn't flinch, he didn't rush, and he didn't speak. The patience and precision that had made him Harlem's most feared and respected figure radiated through every inch of his posture. Junie Bird's hand tightened subtly on his revolver, a signal to Bumpy that he noticed the outsider. Willie Fish Jackson leaned back just enough to keep a clear line of sight, and Quick Lewis's fingers brushed the grip of his gun. Loyalty surrounded Bumpy like a wall. Yet the presence of Vinny reminded everyone that even the most controlled situations could unravel in an instant. Harlem streets had always been full of unexpected twists, and tonight was proving that even legends couldn't predict every variable. The restaurant was a powder keg. Smoot's breathing came in short, sharp bursts, his mind racing with scenarios of escape, survival, and betrayal. He had thought the danger ended with Bumpy, but now he realized the past was only one part of the challenge. Outside forces had watched, waited, and now were calculating how to exploit the situation. One wrong move, one sudden reflex, and the history of Harlem could spill into chaos. Vinny Moretti leaned casually against a pillar, pretending disinterest, but his sharp eyes never left the table. Every patron in the room, now aware of his presence, shifted nervously. The stakes had just risen. The confrontation that had been intense seconds ago now carried layers of political tension, personal danger, and potential chaos. The audience, both in the restaurant and the viewers of the story, could feel it. Bumpy Johnson had returned to Harlem. But even he would have to navigate the unexpected, and no one could predict how the razor's shadow would reach beyond Table 7. Smooth realized with cold clarity that the betrayal he had thought he could outrun for 11 years had been only the beginning. And now, Harlem was watching, waiting, and holding its breath for what would come next. Smooth Henderson's knees buckled under the weight of fear as Bumpy Johnson slowly rose from his chair, the razor folded back into his pocket. Silence had fallen over Small's paradise, so complete it was almost physical. Even Vinny Moretti, the outsider who had slipped in unnoticed, felt the authority in the room pressing down on him. The legacy of Harlem streets made flesh and bone standing in front of him. Every eye in the restaurant followed Bumpy. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the reckoning that had been coming for 11 years. Bumpy walked around the table with deliberate steps, closing the distance between him and Smooth Henderson. There was no hurry, no rush, just a steady certainty that the moment demanded attention. Smooth's face was pale, sweat mixed with the fear that burned through him like fire. He had spent over a decade believing he could escape the consequences of betrayal, but now he understood. You can't cheat the streets that built you, and you can't cheat Bumpy Johnson. In one swift motion, Bumpy gestured toward Smooth and said quietly, "Stand up." Smooth obeyed, his legs trembling violently. The razor came out again, but not for blood. This time was a mark of authority. Bumpy ran the steel across Smooth's cheek, leaving a thin scar. The room gasped, not in shock at violence, but in understanding. This scar was more than punishment. It was a symbol, a lesson, and a warning. Smooth screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the collective awareness of everyone in Harlem that justice had arrived, precise and public. Bumpy stepped back, signaling Smooth to leave Harlem within 24 hours. Smooth, trembling, nodded, and without another word, he exited, disappearing into the night, leaving a trail of whispers and a lesson that would echo for years. The patrons of Small's Paradise slowly exhaled, realizing they had witnessed a masterclass in control, patience, and respect. Harlem streets belonged to a man who didn't need armies to enforce his rule. He commanded loyalty, fear, and reverence. Vinny Moretti, still leaning against a pillar, now approached Bumpy with cautious curiosity. "You're back and still untouchable," he said, voice low. Bumpy's eyes met his, cold and steady. "Harlem doesn't belong to outsiders," Bumpy replied, "and it never will." Vinny nodded slowly, understanding that tonight was not just about Smooth, but about reaffirming the rules, the hierarchy, and the respect owed to the man who built the streets. As Bumpy turned to leave, the patrons erupted in murmurs, some daring to applaud, others simply whispering the legend of the night they had witnessed. The tension had broken, but the lesson remained clear. Betrayal carries a price, respect commands obedience, and Bumpy Johnson's name alone could enforce both. Just as he stepped out into the night, a faint, almost playful laugh echoed from the back of the club. From the shadows, another figure emerged, a younger man, unknown to the patrons, watching everything unfold with calculating eyes. Bumpy's jaw tightened as recognition flickered across his face. This was someone new, ambitious, and untested, but already observing the streets, already learning. The game wasn't over. Harlem's story had more chapters, and Bumpy knew the next move would come sooner than anyone expected. The night ended with Harlem holding its breath. Smooth Henderson was gone, the Italians humbled, and Bumpy Johnson had reclaimed his empire. But the streets whispered of a new challenge, one that promised to keep Harlem on edge. The razor had done its work, but the story, like Harlem itself, was far from finished. By sunrise, Harlem was alive in a way it hadn't been for over a decade. Word of Bumpy Johnson's return had spread faster than any rumor, carried by street hustlers, barbershop gossip, and even the early morning newsboys shouting headlines on the corners. Table 7 at Small's Paradise became the stuff of legend. The night everyone remembered when a man didn't just reclaim territory, he reclaimed respect. Smooth Henderson was gone, the scar on his face a permanent warning, and the streets had learned that loyalty and trust weren't negotiable. Bumpy didn't rush back into his empire. He spent the following weeks reconnecting with old allies, checking on loyal collectors, and quietly letting everyone know that the rules hadn't changed. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was his kingdom, and anyone who thought otherwise would quickly find out that the king had returned. The Italians, who had tried to move into the territory, understood that fighting him was more costly than bowing. In less than 6 months, every piece of the empire he had built before prison was fully restored, not through violence alone, but through calculated power, fear, and intelligence. Junie Bird, Willie Fish Jackson, and Quick Lewis remained by his side, the men who had stayed loyal when others vanished. Bumpy didn't just reward loyalty. He protected it, nurtured it, and reminded everyone that respect was earned through action, not words. The city learned a lesson that night. A Real king doesn't need armies or threats. He doesn't just punish betrayal, he teaches it. And Bumpy Johnson was still Harlem's godfather. Even as the streets settled into a new rhythm, Bumpy's mind never stopped working. He knew challenges would return, ambitions would rise, and new faces would try to carve their own paths. But the razor at Table 7 had done more than mark one-man betrayal. It had sent a message across every block, every corner, and every alley in Harlem. The rules had not changed. Betrayal carried consequences, loyalty carried reward, and Bumpy Johnson was always watching. The legacy of that night became part of Harlem's fabric. Old-timers retold the story in whispers and loud barbershop debates alike. Young hustlers, who had only heard of Bumpy's name, now understood what it meant. Every time someone thought about stepping out of line, they remembered the scar on Smooth Henderson's face. That scar wasn't just a mark. It was a warning, a story, a piece of history that would never fade. Bumpy himself returned to the quieter moments, sitting in his apartment overlooking the city he'd fought to protect. He didn't need applause or recognition. The respect of Harlem was enough. And yet, even in these quieter hours, there was a sense that the streets were alive with possibility. New players would come, new challenges would rise, but now everyone knew one thing. Bumpy Johnson didn't make threats. He made promises, and he always kept them. If you felt the tension of that night, the loyalty, the betrayal, and the razor's mark, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of Harlem's legends. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done if you were in Smooth Henderson's place. The streets of Harlem are full of stories, and this one is a reminder that power isn't just about guns. It's about respect, intelligence, and the courage to face those who betray you. Bumpy Johnson's legacy is proof that kings aren't born. They're made, tested, and remembered.